participants for this webinar, and which is on a very topical issue, the prevailing world situation, prevailing world order, concerning all of us and all countries, militarily, diplomatically, economically. The webinar will have the participants throwing light on Russia, Ukraine, and effects of India on Indian economy. For the event, we have a very illustrious panel consisting of Ambassador Venkatesh Varma, Ambassador Manjeev Puri, Lieutenant General P.S. Rajeshwar, Major General Kulwant Nijjar, Mr. Abheek Barua, and Mr. Saugata Bhattacharya. The session is being chaired by none other than the advisor at EGROW Foundation, Mr. Suman Bery, and he's a well-known economist, writer, academician. Suman Bery was the Director General of National Council of Applied Economic Research, New Delhi, and he has served as a member of Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council, India's Statistical Commission, RBI's Technical Advisory Committee on Monetary Policy. And prior to heading NCAER, Mr. Bery was with the World Bank, Washington, D.C. Currently, he is a non-resident fellow at Bruegel, Brussels, and senior fellow at MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. I now hand over the session to the chair, Mr. Suman Bery, to take the session forward.
Thank you very much. I hope I can be heard. Can I? Yes. Well, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to chair this event. It would have been even more exciting for me had we had the presence of Dr. Arvind Vimani, but because he combines, as it were, the three themes of this seminar. He is knowledgeable on the Indian economy, of course, having been chief economic advisor, and has a great deal of knowledge of military matters and diplomacy, but unfortunately he can't be here, so you will have to cope with a substitute. So let me just indicate what I see as the goals of this event, which are designed obviously for the audience. And we are in the middle of, I'm going to call it a war. The diplomats here may not agree to that point. And truth is the biggest enemy, is the biggest casualty in a war, as we know. And my larger goal in steering the event and the discussion would be to give the audience a sense of what is at stake for India in what is happening in Europe at the moment. And the organizers of this webinar have been astute in assembling military people, diplomats, and economists. And we will actually conduct the discussion in those three blocks. First, to hear from the military people, then to hear from the diplomats, and finally to hear from the economists. Let me add to what Colonel Mahindra Singh said, is that I did have a stint as the chief economist of Shell, and to the extent that what is happening in global energy markets becomes relevant, I'll put in a word or two on that. So the flow will be that I will introduce each speaker in turn in the blocks that I've mentioned. I would request that they limit their prepared remarks to around 7 minutes. I'll try and indicate if they're going well beyond that. I may, at the end of each block, try and summarize a couple of the points that have come up that are of interest to me. But ultimately, it will be the discussion amongst the panel and then the Q&A from the audience, which is how the discussion would take place. So without further ado, let me now start with the military dimension, where General Rajeshwar has agreed to lead off. His background is in artillery, if I understand right, and he served as the 12th Chief of Integrated Defense Staff of the Indian Armed Forces for a while, and he has been awarded various medals, including the Ati Vishisht Seva Medal in 2018 and the Vishisht Seva Medal in January 2016. General Rajeshwar, the floor is yours, and if you wish to indicate why in particular this is an interest, this subject is an area of expertise for you, I would welcome that. Over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair, fellow panelists, EGROW members, and all those attending. At the outset, as a military man and having been in charge of tri-service organization like the IDS, I think I can provide some opportunity of understanding as what the military as an overall would think about this conflict. Looking at what I wish to cover is the war's military dimensions and also what impact it has for India. These, of course, are the statements that you are fully aware have been made by the leaders. Right. Next. Here, can I have the next slide, please? Right. To start with the Russian campaign, you are familiar perhaps with the words of hybrid and conventional war. The Russians have doctrinally believed largely in, posing military threats, but perhaps not taking it to the point of actually a conflict. As far as, their military per se doctrine is concerned, it is based on firepower, and which means artillery, armor, air power is their fundamental core of doing military operations. As far as the strategic goal of this war is concerned, I think it has been, to my understanding, it has been either capture or otherwise lay siege to Kiev and do a regime change. As you look at the map, my sense of the desired end state would be that get hold of Kiev as such, and the sliver towards the east, consolidate in the Donbass region to the east, and then secure a land bridge all along southeast of Ukraine, right down to as far as possible to the coast, perhaps even up to Odessa. When you look at the force comparison, you're looking at 900,000 troops of Russian versus Ukraine's 200,000, plus of course reserves on both sides. Capabilities, if you look at the Russian Air Force, it really outnumbers 1,800 aircraft to about 200 for the Ukrainians. Total supremacy in on the naval front, and militarily, of course, 3 to 4 times of every component and much more advanced. So the basic plan was 3-pronged. One is from the north and northeast. The second is from the eastern side, consolidation in the Donbass, and the last one was from the south and the southeast. Okay, next slide, please. No, just go back one. I think you've jumped us. Yeah. Before I go to what the Ukrainian response has been, just a quick look at the dispositions. On the left is given what was before the war. And I'm looking at, end January, mid-February timeframes, more than 100,000 troops, posturing. And now, as we see, this is of course a day old. You are looking at advances, right up to Kyiv, northwest, northeast, a little bit of consolidation in the Donbass, but a lot of success in the south and southeast. this is how it is, and these are of course areas which are controlled. So and there are counterattacks going, so it's a very fluid situation. As far as the Ukrainian response, I think our understanding was it would not be as robust as it has turned out to be, but they seem to have had a defensive plan where they got hold of the cities, mobilized a lot of people, and held the lines as they, they made the Russian movement very difficult by interdicting. You've seen some videos in the northeast of Kyiv. They've improvised. Look at Molotov cocktails, hedgehog traps, tank traps, and so on. The information war has been great with TikTokers, Facebook, WhatsApp on both sides. And what has held out is the resoluteness of the Ukrainians. Right. So there have been great expectations on both sides, and they'll continue to be as we go ahead. Next slide, please. A quick analysis. It's a strategic paradox where nuclear Russia and on the West, there is a nuclear chance. So there is a conventional war which is being fought at this. What is interesting is open source intelligence is really converting a lot of issues, whether it's Maxer technologies for satellites or what have you. Air-ground cooperation on the Russian side has been a little weak. In fact, it doesn't seem to be a very coordinated effort. The Americans, as you are aware, fortified the Ukrainian cyber points, and therefore we're not seeing too much of that. There has been a lack of precision fires, and therefore you see such vast devastation. Leadership has been very huge in pockets in a lot of places. Of course, what is coming to front because of information is the Ukrainian leadership. Urban warfare is difficult wherever it is. And logistics and communications have been weak on the Russian side. Social media I've already given. Time and information, to my mind, are going against the Russians. The longer it goes, the more information, the difficult it is for the attacker. Therefore, the performance has been a bit patchy, although it's quite appreciable if I look at it from a military term. What's my prognosis? Unless there is a talk is successful, it could run into an insurgency, or there could be hardened, areas on which both sides will have their forces within Ukraine. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. Yeah, implications for India. My understanding is strategically, there is going to be a dilution of focus on Asia, especially the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. Will it encourage Chinese brinkmanship? This is a moot point, but my sense is yes, the timing may not be the next, the immediate thing, since, I don't think they are right for it at the moment. But I think in the time frame of, let's say, the next 5 years, there is a good possibility.
Because I mostly do outing, so.
Manjeev, do you go?
I have to catch on to.
Could somebody mute themselves, please? Please continue, General.
Russian support to our endeavors in the future, I think this question mark I have put. So one will need to take a hard look, because they are now being supported by China in a lot of their endeavors. Defense equipment dependency, we have a lot of equipment, as everyone is aware, almost more than 50%, and especially with the S-400, there is a lot of money involved, and there is a lot of flow which yet needs to come in. Do we need something to bind our things together? My sense is it should have been done yesterday, which is a national security strategy. Even tomorrow will be good enough, but as soon as possible. Operationally, the military, I think the key thing is to put our money in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Integrate as fast as possible. My sense is, again, 5 to 10 years, it can't be faster. Joint doctrine and planning, I think that can be immediate within a year. And making good use of the budget is very, very key, especially now that Make in India will, my sense is it will cost us much more to establish things within our country, but we have no choice but to do it. So with that, I end my piece. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, General, for the time and care you obviously put into this and the clarity of your points. I won't engage you in discussion. Let me move immediately to General Nijjar, who, amongst other things, is an aviator and a disaster management expert. But may I ask you, General Nijjar, to briefly indicate what, in your experience, you are drawing upon to illuminate for the audience the present situation between Russia and Ukraine. Over to you, General.
Thank you, Dr. Bery. To start, I'll firstly indicate what are likely demands of Mr. Putin. Firstly, he wants to recognize Crimea as a part of Russia. Russia wants independence of the separatist eastern states. And they don't want Ukraine to join EU or NATO. Around 15 minutes back on one of the channels, two headlines came which are of importance to us. Zelensky has said that Ukraine will not join NATO. And Russia has indicated that they want a demilitarized Ukraine like Austria. So if these two things work out, I feel the conflict may be resolved in a shorter time frame. Coming on to how it affects India, I won't waste any time. Like General Rajeshwar brought out, the major weapons we are relying on Russia are firstly Navy. The aircraft carrier has come from Russia. We've leased a nuclear submarine from them. We are taking one more from them in a short period of time. And in the long run, we are developing our own nuclear submarine with help from Russia. For the Air Force, we are getting more Sukhoi 30s, MiG-29s for the Navy. We are getting Mi-17 helicopters and Mi-35s are already with us. For the armed forces, that is the Army, we are contracting and working out production of Kamov in India near Bangalore in a place called Tumkur. The S-400s, T-72 tanks, T-90 tanks. With the Chinese conflict for Ladakh, we are looking at light tanks from them. We are looking at artillery, and for the infantry, we are looking at the Kalashnikov rifles being joint produced between them and India. Not to mention BrahMos missiles, which we plan to export to the Southeast Asian countries. So with sanctions coming on Russia from EU, from America and other countries, all our plans may be in jeopardy. So I'll firstly cover how we can overcome this in the middle term and in the short term. I'll talk about two triangles. First triangle is India, Russia, USA. Now it depends what is the final agreement between Ukraine and Russia and what is the extent of sanctions that are withdrawn from the present scenario, based on which India may be able to carry on the procurement of arms from Russia in the desired time frame. Now, after a war, a country is weakened and the defense production also goes into a limbo. So it will take Russia some time to rake up their defense production and start their exports. The first priority will be to rearm their forces, make up the lost weapons so that they come to a desired state of preparedness. Only after that will they start doing the export part. But on the flip side, they want money, so they may do the export part first and rake up their armed forces a little later on. So first part is how fast can we handle USA and Russia and resume our supplies of arms and ammunition. The next triangle I'm talking about is India, China and Russia. Now, Russia has become a little weak because of sanction and the military expenditure they've undergone, and China is kind of supporting them. So China may have an upper hand over Russia, and in a future conflict with India, it may be limited or it may not happen. We realize that a conflict does not pay off and China will not go in for a conflict with India. And as per their stated policy also till 2049, they are not keen to have a conflict with any country because they want to overtake USA. So China may support Russia and Russia will have to support China. If India plays this delicately and sensibly, Russia may help India to overcome its differences with China, and our military expenditure on the Chinese border may come down. The China has got a very interesting thing called cartographic aggression. So that has to be overcome. So Pakistan, as far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan can draw a limited advantage from this conflict because they are relying on Russia and China for some supplies which may not work out in a big way because economically Pakistan is in a down state and we should not worry too much about Pakistan. In the long term, how do we avoid this kind of a conflicting situation where we have to please Russia also to take arms from them and please USA also? We have to make in India. So Atmanirbhar Bharat is the way forward. Till the time we can do that, we have to diversify our arm productions and import from other countries. We've already come down from 70% from Russia to around 50%. We have to cut it down further, but we all know it won't take less than 4, 5, 6 years to come down to that level. So that is where we stand in the coming months. It is more of a diplomacy than a military thing for us. How do we handle USA and Russia to keep our defense needs and at a satisfactory level of readiness so that we are not adversely affected by any Chinese misadventure? And I like to end by saying I'm reading a book about Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan. They were the people who the Central Asia, the Eastern Asia, that is China, USA, up to Turkey, they had combined this. USSR was a kind of a smaller part of that kind of a setup. Now USSR may try to expand itself and NATO is trying to expand itself. So it's a war between NATO and USSR who can stop the other from expanding. And this aggression in Ukraine, I think, is a result of that expansion policy of Russia and of NATO. With that, I'll end my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. So, I think both of you, either deliberately or inadvertently, have very much set up the interventions by the diplomats. But just what struck me is the contrast between, as it were, the tone of what General Rajeshwar had to say, which was essentially that the performance of the Russian military, while adequate, has not been stellar. And I'm sure that, that's interesting and important because it's coming from an informed and neutral source, because what we're getting on the Western media is obviously very much part of a propaganda war. But from you, General Nijjar, I think we did, in a sense, get both the sense that this may not drag on, but also that if our diplomats do their job, this is a situation which is salvageable. It's not for India.
Yes.
And particularly the point that you made about Pakistan being a sideshow, I think is important coming from a military man. And so, as per prior agreement, may I turn to Ambassador Varma, who was a member of the IFS till 2021, worked in the office of the External Affairs Minister and in the PMO, and served as India's ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, to Spain, and to the Russian Federation as recently as October 2021. So, Ambassador Varma, you, in a sense, in your professional career, have encountered the collapse of the Soviet Union, which, as we know, President Putin considers one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. You have also seen the forward movement by, as General Nijjar said, by NATO to occupy the space when Russia was relatively weakened. So I think both your sense of how we came to this path and how, to build on what the General said, how Indian diplomacy can extract opportunity from the present dispensation. I think we're all ears. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to join the EGROW Foundation seminar. I'm delighted to be with senior colleagues, especially Ambassador Puri. I think the current situation is a good occasion for a myth buster. There are several myths floating around, and if we look carefully, the events in Ukraine help us clarify what the real world is about. Let's start with the first. First, it is a war in Ukraine, but it is a global conflict between Russia and the West. President Zelensky is addressing the US Congress this evening, India time, and it is quite expected that the United States will up whatever it has provided to Ukraine many times over. In the last 3 weeks, the United States has provided $10 billion worth of aid from Congress. Never in history has the United States Congress provided in one go $10 billion as foreign assistance to any country. And it is topped up with 300 billion yesterday and a couple of billion, 300 million yesterday. And so this is an escalating level of support, both from the United States, NATO, and the West. On the other hand, Russia is continuing with its grinding military operation in Ukraine. And the war is the first hybrid war of the 21st century. And I think our military should study this very carefully. There were very strong trends that were coming in, especially this new phenomenon of how technology has morphed, where the David and Goliath scene is now repeating itself in a macro scale. We first saw it in the Azeri-Azerbaijan conflict, and now we are seeing it now between what the Ukrainians are doing with the Russians. Of course, the escalation possibilities are very high. The foreign fighters coming in, new weapons coming in. The Ukrainians are talking to the Russians. The Russians are saying that they are willing to settle for a neutral status for Ukraine, like on the terms of Switzerland or to Austria. My sense is that Ukraine is not an independent actor anymore. Even if Ukraine is willing to surrender, they will not be allowed to surrender. The West has come in a very big way, and we are getting in for a very big fight. Number two, geopolitics has punctured globalization, and globalization is collapsing right in front of our eyes. I'm not an economist, but every year, at the beginning of every year, I read Ruchir Sharma. For common people like me, he summarizes the world, and he wrote this 10 economic trends that define 2022. It's on the 3rd of January in the Financial Times. I read it again today to see which of the trends that we are currently facing have been captured by Ruchir Sharma. The answer is 0. The reason being, it's not that Ruchir Sharma is not smart. He is one of the smartest people we know. But geopolitics is not the field of people who've been trained in globalization. Globalization had certain presumptions which were taken for granted, that there will be no big power conflict that is happening. Globalization, there were certain no-go areas. There were some common global commons. The SWIFT was considered a global common. The protection of central banks was considered sacrosanct. Social, technological, and airspace isolation was considered infeasible. All that has happened. The West is looking for economic blackout in Russia and a technological and news blackout of Russia in the information sphere, and that has already happened. You hear very little of the Russia story. But Russia is grinding on. Russia is fighting a 20th century war in Ukraine. The war will be decided on the ground. Now, what does it say about globalization? There are two major trends that are going to hit us very, very hard. One is the energy dislocation, and the next is the food and commodities dislocation. In the COVID period, major economies of the world pumped in $14 trillion. That money is already sloshing around in the economy. You add to that the disruptions that are coming up, and the war is being fought with Russia and intervened with the Russia-Ukraine conflict with almost no thought to the after effects on the global economy. Such is the rage and the mood in the West to fix Russia. They almost have no thought is being given to what it would do to the outside world. Inflation is round the corner, massive inflation. And as governments take care of inflation, we are looking at a combination of a political instability, a large geopolitical conflict, and a global recession. Now, we've not had this combination for a very, very long time. Now, on India, we didn't contribute to this conflict. We are not party to this conflict. So I think in the national discourse, we should get rid of this notion that somehow we owe an answer to someone else. We don't. That was the good old days of globalization when there was a give and take that was globally shared. That has collapsed. We need to look after ourselves, such as there is the concept of supply chains and interoperability has collapsed. That has collapsed in the economic side. And I would urge our defense people to look very carefully on the notion of interoperability, where ownership does not guarantee any control on how we can protect our national interest without being overtly dependent on foreign sources, either it is Russia or the United States or anyone else. In my own view, this notion that Russia is an ally of China is a myth. It is based on exaggeration. No big power as China will be an ally with a weak and vulnerable power like Russia. It is an exploitative relationship, and we have gaps in that which we should exploit. Similarly, this notion that the United States will come and sort of save us in the Indo-Pacific and the Quad is again, disappearing right in front of our eyes. The United States is coming back in a very big way to Europe. Europe is united today. There is one voice in Europe, and that is the voice of the United States. So these are very, very big global changes that are taking place. Very rarely in history have we had a combination of so many disruptive forces of such a macro and fundamental level taking place at the same time. With that, I will end and we'll join in the question and answer session. Thank you.
No, thank you for being so emphatic and clear and, dare I say it, provocative. Ambassador Puri, you have your prepared remarks, but if I could just, ask you, if there's time and space, to dwell on why this has become this kind of test of wills between Russia and the West. This seemed to come out of nowhere, although we do know that there were antecedents going back to what happened after the fall of with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But as Ambassador Varma has said, for this now to become, in a sense, the pivotal moment in global international affairs, perhaps you could provide your sense of quite why now, in addition to what else you were wishing to contribute. And again, Ambassador Varma, thank you so much. Over to you, Manjeev.
Dr. Bery, thank you very much for giving me the screen. And, you know, I told you that Ambassador Varma is certainly one of those from the Indian Foreign Service, not only the fact that he served in Russia, but someone who studied the matters. And I must agree with you that this is a somber movement, a time for us to reflect seriously. At the same time, I think the facts that he says that this is an inflection point also needs to be understood. If you would recall, just a few months back, there were innumerable number of books, even I've authored papers for those, post-COVID world, which was a code word for post-China. But please note, that hasn't gone away. And that is also there for us to stay. So let me say a few slightly different things. Some way may match with what Ambassador Varma said, some may not. And I am not here to, sort of play for the government of India's worldview. I think when you are in the seat, there are many decisions that you need to take. Many people are asking us, why did you abstain? Well, one little point I should make to you, and Venkat is very aware of this. An abstention by a non-permanent member of the Security Council is a vote which stops the resolution from going through. That's the nature of the mathematics out there, because you need 9 affirmative votes. And if, some people look here and there, that can happen. We had a case in 2011 with the Libyan resolution. They could barely get it passed. And these things do happen. So please make a note. The others also make a note of these things. We abstained. Nobody's interested in what explanations you gave. Those explanations, we know where they come from. The fact is, did we have any choice? Perhaps we had no choice in the matter. But let me leave a thought in a lighter vein with everyone here, including in the somber atmosphere that perhaps Venkat has contributed to. When we used to really talk about NAM as the number one thing on a flagpole, and if you did what you did, many people wouldn't criticize you. When you had lean west for such a long time, and there may be very good reasons for it. The fact is that those countries count their friends. It's not that you count on friends. That's what we do. But they count their friends. Remember the coalition of the willing and all those things. There was Qatar sending 45 people for the fight. That's the nature of those economies. And they make a note of these things. So, there is a price to be paid for lean. It's not such a simple matter which goes here and there, whichever way. And our economy took a solid hit from COVID. There's no doubt about it. And, we haven't been particularly greatly successful in military technologies, in military developments. And frankly, our economy has not been kicking. I'm happy to hear my colleagues from the banks, say whatever else, but it's a very tough call. I want to make 2 or 3 points to you on the global thing. And let me take you back to World War II. In World War II, finally, the Europeans found themselves vanquished by the Anglo-Saxons, and I mean the Americans are only an extension of the fellows who started and who keep making all these kinds of statements that we see. They're the lightning rod, the Brits. This vanquishing was accepted by the Europeans. All the wars before that left them still continuing in their own fashion in whatever way. This vanquishing, what did it result in? They did almost nothing for 65 odd years. They built the EU. They did try something or the other. But my God, what a sledgehammer have they got? Venkat used the term that the only voice in Europe is American. I have a simple question to ask. Is this a voice as a result of willingness, or is it a voice of being bludgeoned one way or the other? I would leave it a little differently from this. When Nord Stream 2 was to be shut down, the German Chancellor looked the other way on SWIFT, on energy purchases, on everything. Multipolarity has taken a hit. That has implications for all of us. Now, you can keep saying it's the West versus those guys, the United States versus them. That's fine. But in some senses, the world that we thought would be possible, degrees of multipolarity, Europe has taken a tremendous hit, and I think that should be very clearly understood by everyone. What happens in the Russian context, etc., I don't know. But let me say this very simply. For the United States, let's look at some domestic policy business. President Biden, who had the lowest approval ratings following Kabul and who had poor support in the Congress, never has any time ever seen the kind of bipartisan support that has come by. Will it affect the November elections? I don't know. It's too early to talk about. But look at the kind of directional thrust and change. At the same time, won't American companies, oil and gas companies, armaments companies, etc., perhaps be seeing, that their stock prices should be going up, etc. The Chinese, on the other hand, also staying some distance away, maybe doing whatever they are with Russia across their border. That's a different matter. But please note the Jake Sullivan meeting with the Chinese NSA. And, are we looking at a G2 being formed in a different set of the way? And one, where are we going to be? I, of course, am kind of optimistic. I believe that, even if you are on the ducking end of things, at some stage, a change in the polarity of the world might just give you an opportunity. After all, in 1945, it was the Americans who grandfathered China becoming a permanent member of the Security Council. It was not going to happen. Nobody in the world ever thought that a surrogate country in that state should have been made a permanent member of the Security Council, but it did. Would we have an opportunity through that? Most of my colleagues who say if the global horseshoe table has to be changed around, there needs to be some kind of apocalypse. Is it that? I don't know the answers to all. But you're talking about India. This is a point to think about. We are seeing a lot, and indeed, Dr. Bery, your own question to me started off by saying that India has earned considerable opprobrium in the Western media. Obviously, we couldn't have expected anything else. Is it the right step? Is it not the right step? Time, of course, will tell. But there are various factors which propelled us to take the steps that we did, rightly so. But abstention perhaps is not really easy for those who aim to be players in the game. And if you have to be stakeholders, I'm not pitching for a push to the West, but I'm saying that this has to be played and played adroitly. And frankly, there will be no free pass as far as we are concerned. And I haven't talked about the energy markets, what it will do to the Indian economy and so on, because I'm sure our colleagues will talk about all of those. But the diminishing of Europe, the diminishing of multipolarity, is it an opportunity or a challenge? I don't know. At the moment, in my opinion, it looks like a challenge. I hope it gets converted to an opportunity. It's all in all very tough for us, especially coming out of COVID, the economic situation that we are facing. This was the least of the things that we would have expected and wanted to have. Thank you.
Sorry. So what comes across very forcefully from your two interventions is that this is a big deal, okay? And it's going to be, it doesn't come at a good time for India, but that it is a fairly radical shift in the kaleidoscope. It's not minor, and we'll come back to that in the general discussion. But incidentally, Saugata, since we've already admitted one slide presentation, please feel free to use yours if you want to. But I'll, in the meantime, ask Abheek to lead the economic discussion. So, Abheek, I think what is on the table is first a set of propositions about globalization, the global economy, longer term, which have implications for India's general policy stance. There was, of course, there is the doctrine of Atmanirbharta. A lot of economists don't particularly care for it. A lot of economists were critical of the decision to opt out of something like RCEP, but that's for the longer term. I think for the here and now, we need to pick up on the point that Ambassador Puri has made, which is that this is one more shock on an already enfeebled economy. So I think because you study the Indian economy day to day, the question both of the channels by which this shock will affect India and what the tools are available to mitigate the shock economically, domestically. Forget the international diplomacy bit, which we'll come back to. I think we look forward to this. But to your comments, also remembering, that oil prices have gone up and down in the past, and India has survived. So if you wanted to isolate what might make this shock different, I think that would be a contribution. Over to you, Abheek. You're muted. You're muted.
I'm sorry, I apologize. Well, let me just quickly talk about the channels through which this conflict will affect India and indeed the global economy, and is currently affecting the economies across the world. Well, there are essentially three channels. One is the inflation channel, and it's not just about energy prices, it's also about other commodities like metals. The second channel is, of course, the possibility of slowing growth, hence the sort of the specter of stagflation, which is a serious slowdown combined with very high prices. And the third, which we are also facing, is that of extreme risk aversion, or the phenomena of flight to safety, or as we refer to the market, a risk-off environment, which affects capital flows. So we've seen a large amount of money which was invested by foreign investors going back to America, into US Treasury bonds and so forth. On the inflation question, clearly, I think there are people who are flagging the risk of significantly elevated commodity and energy prices for a fairly long time. I will make a somewhat sort of contrarian statement and say that these two things perhaps are not entirely consistent or compatible. And what I would argue is that if these prices, say the price of oil, goes above a certain level, then it will set off a major slowdown in the economy, and it will bring about some amount of automatic correction. You can call it a sort of a negative feedback loop in the oil market. Whether it's happening already or not, one doesn't know. There are other factors at play. There's this problem with China, etc. But I somehow do not believe that oil and other commodity prices are in for a period of continued rise, and I do see some moderation setting in by the second half of the year at the latest, if not earlier, because markets are known to price in events, demand destruction and so forth, much ahead of when it actually happens. So in terms of, and of course, there's this challenge to growth, and I'm glad many of you use the word enfeebled economy, because I don't think we are on as robust a footing as, say, the US is as far as growth is concerned. So when it comes to handling this, and in terms of monetary fiscal policy, this might be heresy to some who've been very critical of the RBI for falling behind the curve on raising rates. I would still say that treat this as largely a supply shock, which is sort of persisting for a while, but monetary action, which is tightening on the lines of what the Fed is or the Western central banks are likely to do, is not the answer for us. And perhaps we should cushion the shock through fiscal action, perhaps cut excise duties, provide subsidies on fertilizers. The economy is still very, very fragile, and fretting and acting too much on the inflation front through the conventional tool of interest rates is perhaps not the solution at this stage. And this sort of is consistent with my view that by the second half, we should see significantly lower prices for commodities, both industrial metals and energy. I would just like to sort of end my opening remarks by talking about the costs of not picking a side. And clearly, I mean, the opprobrium that you referred to in your mail, the pressure for India to clearly align with one of the two in what is clearly a sort of a deglobalizing and a bipolar world with the West on the one side and China and Russia on the other side, along with its sort of satellites like the Southeast Asian countries. We don't really know about France, which seems to be somewhere still sitting on the fence because they're not so dependent on natural gas. But I mean, that's not important. I think what are the costs of not picking a side? And I'm just going to sort of refer to a couple of things. One was, this aspiration, during COVID, because of the problems in China, and not just COVID, but because of enduring problems in China, their sudden sort of imposition of regulations on the environment, then on fundraising by some of the tech companies. India was emerging as sort of the plus one in the sort of the China plus one kind of model that people were talking about. Perhaps the opportunities have been exaggerated, but certainly there is scope there. And if we do not, and a lot of the China plus one, or this is sort of the diversification of the supply chain, would be to sort of feed Western factories. And if we do not pick a side, what happens to that strategy going forward is a question that I don't really have an answer to. Number two, I think Europe will go through a bad patch for a while. But what is clearly emerging with the kind of coordination in Europe, unprecedented coordination in Europe, is the possibility of the revival or a buffering of an industrial military complex in Europe. One is not very sure of the US because they might tend to get bogged down in their domestic, very, very fractious domestic politics. But clearly, once they're past the current pain, their complete reworking of priorities, particularly on defense, is going to lead to a very different kind of Europe in terms of its focus. And as we know, defense spending does lead to very significant and often unanticipated benefits for the larger economy. So if we again do not pick a side, do we sort of miss out on a possible plug-in to that source of demand? And finally, we are dependent. There is one of the things that perhaps needs to be emphasized is that it's not just governments who are taking decisions. It's really companies, investors, etc., who are taking decisions. So both in terms of the China plus one sourcing as well as capital flows, if we do not pick a side, are we going to lose out? Not because of explicit curbs or sanctions by Western governments, but simply because investors and companies do not want to, take a stake in someone in a country that has not aligned with what they think is, the right side of the crusade. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Abheek. We are running a little over time, but because we want there's so many important points that have been raised, I want to allow the opportunity for a discussion amongst the panel, and there are a couple of questions from the audience. But Saugata, last but certainly not least, please complement what Abheek has had to say, and feel free to use your slides, but I will keep you to the time. Go ahead.
So thank you, Dr. Bery. Thank you, EGROW Foundation, for giving me this platform. I certainly, I'm not going to use the slide. I mean, you know, this was supposed to, since you have already put this on, the next slide, please. So I'm going to disagree with Abheek a little bit. What's the fun of being an economist if we don't agree with our peers? So I mean, a little bit of disagreement there. So let me start by saying that what I'm going to say will pertain to a sequence over the sequence of impacts over the short term, say over the 3 to 6 months, over the medium term, a year to a couple of years, and then some deeper structural changes which we are likely to see over a longer period of time. So point number one is that even before this crisis hit, I'm not just talking about India being enfeebled. Global growth was forecast to have slowed down in 2022 compared to the growth, the rampant growth, blazing growth that the global economy saw in 2021, fueled by fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, etc. In particular, merchandise trade was forecast to come down from almost a 10% growth in 2021 to half of that, around about 4.8% in 2022. So that already would have impacted a significant engine of growth as far as India was concerned. India's growth, India's exports last year has been phenomenally high. Will easily hit the target of $400 billion. So now, in terms of growth, so given these global engines of growth, India's GDP is likely to be lower than the forecast 9% for this year, FY22. Maybe not too much, but I mean 8.8, 8.7, etc. We are still continuing with our 8.3 growth forecast, real GDP growth forecast for FY23. But that depends on the persistence of the crisis, how long, in what form this crisis continues over the next couple of months. The immediate concern, though, is inflation. As everybody has pointed out, I mean, you know, global prices have really soared. I put on this chart to show you what economists and finance markets call backwardation. One, you see, so this is the price of crude now to the left-hand side, and then continuing over a period of time at 3 different points of time. This is the current backwardation curve. So right now you can see there's been a significant rise in the level of crude prices, but the short end over the next 6 months, 1 year has risen very sharply. My own sense is this is because of the risk premium, because of the ability to not just the demand supply balance, but just a sheer rush to get at the available crude supplies. Next slide, please. But it's not just crude. The other problem is other commodities. Next slide. I'll skip this. The current major concern is fertilizers. So in terms of India's imports of potash, in particular, Belarus and Russia provide about 40 to 45% of potash supplies into India. And the markets are very tight. There are no alternative, a little bit from here and there, but there are no alternative sources. So fertilizer prices is likely to be a major concern going forward, and this will probably entail a significant higher subsidies for fertilizers in the next year. Even more than crude, although our imports of natural gas is lower, the remarkable thing that you see on this slide is the way that natural gas prices, spot prices, have moved in many of the European countries as expected, as you all heard. But in the US, it hasn't moved at all. I mean, the green line is absolutely flat. So that's one thing which is absolutely remarkable in terms of natural gas supplies, and shows how insulated the US is in terms of natural gas prices. Next slide, please. In terms of this is obviously translated into other fertilizer. Next slide, please. As we said, in terms of fertilizers, this is the price of wheat. I just want to show you some of these things that have gone up, and we are directly impacted in terms of our imports on edible oils. And particularly, I never knew this, that a whole lot of our sunflower oil imports are from Ukraine and Russia. So edible oil prices have gone up, wheat prices have gone up, and then certainly this is going to impact on India. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to quickly go over this. These are the metals prices. So I'll stop over here. So I mean, in terms of inflation, you're going to hear the Federal Reserve, the FOMC meeting minutes today, the announcements today. I wouldn't be surprised if inflation, CPI inflation in the US over the next couple of months hits 10%. So it's completely in the realm of possibility. In India, our CPI inflation will be probably about in the range of 5.6 to 5.8% next year if the current conditions prevail. Remember that even if there is a normalization of prices, these commodity prices, particularly energy, is likely to be reset upwards. We're not going to see the $70, $75 per barrel range that we saw last year. It will probably be $90, $95, $100 per barrel in the near future, at least. So India more importantly, India is likely to face very tight financial conditions because the Federal Reserve is going to hike rates very aggressively. So are many of the other G10 central banks, irrespective their labor markets remain very tight. RBI, on the other hand, as Abheek also mentioned, is more focused on growth. I completely agree that that's what they should be doing. They're only likely to raise rates very, very slowly in baby steps over the course of the next year. Certainly not in the April policy review. But the problem is this policy divergence between India, between RBI and the other G10 central banks is likely to impact India's exchange rates and interest rates. Those are likely to get impacted. Remember, in a macro setup, whether you try to control the price rises by using your fisc or through the OMCs, the oil marketing companies' balance sheet, it will show up in one form or the other in some way. It doesn't matter. There will be macro stresses, irrespective of how you slice the salami. Yeah, so that's going to be the problem. Moving on very quickly into the medium-term scenario, there is likely to be a stress on growth. For example, in the semiconductor chips industry, we all know about the hardware, the chip design, the problems. I mean, the foundries being located in certain countries. I never knew this. That the substances which are used to produce the semiconductor chips, palladium, noble gases like neon, argon, xenon, etc. Those 70% of those coming from Russia and Ukraine. So I mean, all of this is likely to be a huge problem. And there has been some diversification post 2014 Crimea, but the world still remains very, very vulnerable. And there's been some stockpiling done, but the world manufacturing remains very vulnerable to these shocks. In more broadly, in terms of the global value chains, all of you have talked about this. This is likely to be a problem. Unfortunately, as I disagree with Abheek that there has been some move away from China in the China +1, but the bigger moves has been towards the US and then to a certain extent to Europe. India has not figured very prominently in the global value chains diversification. We are probably going to see some diversification, some industries, some segments, etc., but it's not likely to be a very significant shift into India. So the biggest ending in the last 30 seconds, the longer term structural changes. I think this is the thing that is most worrying. The biggest lesson of this crisis is the ability of the dominant countries and groups to weaponize cross-border linkages. The Ukraine conflict has only hardened positions that were evident before. The most critical point of these cross-border linkages is payments. And you've seen the effects of SWIFT, of Visa, MasterCard, some of these things. So our vulnerabilities to moving into these cross-border financial, the payments infrastructure has emerged as a very critical part of the global value chains, etc., that we see. So how do we develop alternatives? How do we develop alternatives via our RuPay, the UPI systems, Unified Payments Interface systems, etc.? How do we link this to the Nexus initiative of the Bank of International Settlements? This is something which is very, very important. So finally, let me end by saying that unlike previous world wars, the next conflict in the world is not likely to be domination of territory, but it's likely to be the domination of technology. So tech dominance is going to be the great game going forward, and we need to be prepared for that. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Saugata. I allowed you to overrun because there were so many interesting points you were making. Okay, so now we come to really what ought to be the heart of the matter, but we've had lots of food for thought. I'm going to start with a couple of domestic points and then broaden out to the diplomatic and global dimensions. I would just invite the comments, certainly of our economists, but others as well, on the imperatives facing the Modi government. I think Saugata and to some extent Abheek have also prioritized growth. The question I have is that we know that Prime Minister Modi is an inflation hawk. We also know that he has a general election coming up in 2024, and the question in my mind is not what he should do or what he will do. Will he actually prioritize growth, or will he send signals out to the MPC and to the Reserve Bank that we should not allow to happen in India what, in effect, Jay Powell has allowed in the Fed, which is to let the genie out of the bottle. So that's one question of mine. And let's remind ourselves also that next year is India's G20 year. That has implications for a number of dimensions of economic diplomacy. But my question back to you, Abheek and Saugata, but also to the others, is really, let me add one other editorial point before handing it over to you. So the question really is, what is different, what is new this time around? We did have a huge commodities boom when China was kind of rebuilding. Oil had been at these kinds of prices, and we sort of managed. So is it that our initial conditions are so different now? Why should this time be so much more challenging for India? Let me just get your thoughts on that and those of any of the other panelists. I don't know whether you can indicate that you want to raise your hand. I know more about Zoom, but let me hear from the two of you, but briefly, please, because there are a lot of interesting issues on the military and diplomatic side as well. Who will go first?
Saugata, why don't you go, please?
No, Abheek, I already had my say. All yours.
Yeah.
No, I think, I mean, the initial conditions are different because we are coming out of, a major economic shock, an unprecedented shock. And, growth, it has picked up. The numbers exaggerate the extent of the pickup because of the base effect and so forth. So 9.2 or 8.8 is not really 8.8. It's closer to 6.5 or a little less. So I mean, I think that is where the initial conditions differ from some other episodes where we had a similar escalation in prices. But I think one of the things which Governor Das keeps emphasizing when this comparison is drawn between Jay Powell's aggression or indeed Madame Lagarde's deep concern is that just look at the divergence between what they are targeting and where they're at. So let me just take the US example. The US CPI target on a steady state is about 2% for their whatever. I'm not going to use technical terms. 2%. They're roughly at 8%, right? We are at 6%-ish. For a period, we'll remain at around 6.5 or whatever because of the crisis today, because of elevated oil prices that they're passed on. And my contention is that it'll sort of then moderate. So what I'm arguing is that on the growth front, the magnitude of the problem confronting Indian policymakers is much bigger than what is confronting Janet Yellen or the White House. Whereas on the inflation front, it's much less of a problem simply in arithmetic terms. If you just look at the difference between target and actual, and we can let it run slip for a while if if it does come back. Of course, I mean, things are dynamic. I mean, if you just get into a spiral of rising commodity prices and they stay there, things will have to change. But I think this inflation expectations management, this is a fiction created by economists to justify many things. I think the only thing that really affects Indian inflation expectations is food, and we need to have very, very aggressive supply management to keep it under check.
Thank you. Saugata, any follow-up comments?
Very, very quickly, 10 seconds. So what we haven't talked about is credit, bank credit, credit from other sources. And obviously one of the key pillars for sustaining growth, which was evident even from this budget, was the critical role that the government is assigning to credit offtake, credit delivery, particularly to the MSME sector, the small and micro enterprises sector. So for that, price stability and relatively interest rate stability and relatively low interest rates is probably one of the key factors that will enable. There are multiple other things, but this is one of the key factors that will enable, that will hopefully enable credit growth. So that's another factor that you need to keep in mind.
Okay, let me now bring in certainly the diplomats and maybe the military as well. So Abheek had argued that there are costs to sitting on the fence, but in the chat box, and I'll read here, it is said, a comment, one of the participants has said, with Russia being a significant supplier for many precious metals and the West keeping these metals out of the sanctions, it is obvious that the West is not going to hurt its own interests. How can India protect its own interests? And of course, the elephant in the room is the fact that the Europeans up till now have not chosen to significantly curtail gas imports. The US and Canada have curtailed oil imports from Russia, but that's inconsequential for them. The point I want to come to is that, and which links up to the point Abheek made, which is with, at least in principle, the CAATSA sanctions being under consideration either by the US administration or the US Congress, but there being this asymmetry in the willingness to inflict pain and accept pain as the, what is, both what are the probabilities, but also more, what are the arguments that India is putting forward and can put forward to indicate that, look, our interests are fundamentally different from, are what they are, and therefore that will determine our behavior. And this links up, of course, with the issue which I get, a lot of blowback from my colleagues at my European think tank, which is what you guys are thinking of rupee-ruble trade to, to undercut the sanctions and to continue importing oil from Russia. So would either the diplomats, Ambassador Puri, Ambassador Varma, just, share with us, as it were, the kinds of arguments we might make as Indian citizens when we come under pressure for being, as it were, unfaithful to the spirit of the Quad and democracies. Ambassador Varma, would you like to lead?
Manjeev, please.
You're muted, sir. Manjeev, sir, please unmute.
Sorry, apologies. Dr. Bery, you used some very nice expressions in the course of your question. Faithfulness to the Quad, are we being right? And then there were these very, very good points made by Abheek on the question of the costs. Of course, there are costs. If you want to be stakeholders and players at the big thing, I don't know if the answer is right to be around bobbing your head on both sides. We did it very well on the line, but then we were not players. Can you do it now? I don't know. I personally perhaps are from a generation which say, yes, you should have done that. And that perhaps would have been better. In fact, much of the opprobrium that you talk about comes on us only because of, let me use this four-letter word, Quad. If this wasn't there, if you were not there, people would have called you mad. But, I think they're using a different three-letter word now. And these are the necessary things. In fact, someone here said very well, Why should a company invest in your country? Because you are not aligned with them. But if you are not in the business of aligning, then maybe people have looked at your market. So I don't know the answers to this. These are the kind of calls that governments take at different points, and that's the necessity of it. In terms of what arguments, look, what are the arguments we can give to the United States or to the Europeans on, let's say, the sanctions against Russia? You can keep saying we are trying to defend ourselves against China. Hey, they're not going to buy that argument anymore. They're not. Why should they buy these arguments? Will we get the waivers? We might, if there is some sweetener somewhere else being put there. Somebody mentioned about buying equipment. Haven't we been doing that all throughout? Why is all this buying of US equipment at inflated costs, which are coming to us? Most of our old military friends would say much better, robust stuff comes to you from the Russians, which is why, generally speaking, other than a few people, most people remain kind of happy with what they are getting. So these are facts. You just have to make the choices. I don't think there are easy answers. The China business, you can keep saying, but now it's becoming a bogey, which is going to become very difficult because they have their own dog in the game. Because it's their dog in the game. As long as it was India, China, and the USSR, and Russia, and the United States was a different kind of ball game, you can try and say, let me get something. Will we still get something? We may. I don't know the way it works out. But at the end of the day, there is politics. Remember, there's domestic politics in the United States. If I may just, digress a little bit, the question about inflation in the United States, remember, there's a lot of money sloshing around there also. So there may be inflation, and it may hurt in the times of the November elections. Will all this coming together help you? I don't know the answers, but people have money in their pockets in the United States. That's also something that we need to consider. Our situations are markedly different from what we are faced with on there, and all of this is these are the straws that governments have to pick, and I would only leave this thought. It's again somewhat facetious, somewhat light-hearted, that multi-alignment. No. Since we are not willing to use the word non-alignment, is a more difficult word than non-alignment.
Okay, Manjeev. While you have the mic, and I'll turn to Ambassador Varma in a minute. So, how do you see Europe's relationship with India and Europe's relationship with China in light of what is happening now in Ukraine? And what I have in mind here is that, China has certainly, and you would know this better than me, reached out to Europe as part of its diversification ploy away from the United States. I mean, there's a lot of debate, as you know, in the media about how much China knew about what Putin was going to do. But is China interested in decoupling from Europe? I doubt it. And if that's the case, does that restrain China in some ways in the support that it provides to Russia? And what does our sitting on the fence possibly imply for our relationship with Europe? A few top-of-mind thoughts, if you could, and then I'll come to Ambassador Varma.
Dr. Bery, let's start with the first one. India-EU FTA. I don't know how many years we've been at it. Today, I heard an Indian ambassador in a major European country say, this is top priority. I wanted to laugh and tell him, brother, many generations before you and after you are going to be saying the same thing. Our collective weight doesn't seem to be making any difference here. In the European Parliament, remember, the FTA will have to go through the European Parliament. People are asking the simple question. The guys are not with us. So, there is always politics to all this. You mentioned that about China. Look, COVID did result in the Chinese getting a fair amount of flack in Europe. After all, remember, the investment agreement, which was agreed between the European Union and China, has really not seen the light of the day, and in all probability looks like buried forever, or at least for the near future. Now, given what may happen in the rest of the world, United States, China, we don't know all of those particular things. But if those sort of things happen, and where are you left with? For me, the most central part is we may be able to manage elements of this economy. And for a variety of reasons, You know, if you were also in Europe, so was I. Many people would say that the reason why we weren't able to make progress with our best partners, the partners we are most comfortable with, that is the Europeans, was because we had opened up to the Americans. And this is not something that we would speak of, but obvious and which keeps happening. What you do with Southeast Asia, what you do with China, Middle East is a different matter. But what do you do with the Europeans? The Americans are very much interested, and their companies are very much interested, and the same set of guys get into the act. And the geopolitics of it was such that surely they carried much more weight than any European countries together or individually put together. So we'll have to see how this game plans out. It's a tough call. There's absolutely no doubt about it at all. But which way the Chinese go? For me, the sadder thing is that it seems to me that Europe as a peg in multipolarity is a diminished factor now once again. And I'm not sure they'll be able to easily come back to it. It helped us in a cause for a place in a more multipolar world, even though everybody was recognizing a kind of G2 which was emerging. But let me make one last point before I stop. In the minds of the people in the United States and the establishment in the US, it is Russia which is the enemy, if I may say so very bluntly, not China. We keep thinking that it should be China. And therefore, many a times we are befuddled with the way the United States acts on matters concerning China. And that is simply because, if you don't mind my saying so, the end product of our decolonization or our colonization, the other part of the globe, we don't understand the Trans-Pacific particularly well. Sorry about a slightly different.
Ambassador Varma, I'll put a question to you, but I would certainly appreciate the comments of the two generals. What is it that we should be wanting and wishing for Russia? I mean, Russia has been a steadfast partner to India. We are very dependent on it, not only for defense. I mean, it has been a revelation to many of us how much we are dependent on it for a bunch of other stuff, from wheat and sunflower oil to noble gases. So do we have leverage, and do we have an endpoint in mind that we can help bring about? What is in our interest for where Russia should end up? May I ask you, and then let me get the two generals to comment as well.
Thank you, Mr. Bery. And I endorse Ambassador Puri's last comment. I think he hit the nail on the head. You know, I think there is a certain gap in what I'm trying to say and what is being understood, especially in this group. I was not trying to be provocative. I probably was trying to underline it a little more clearly. The situation is very alarming. If we think that this is a bad bump in the road, a bad dream, there'll be a ceasefire in Ukraine and things will go back to normal. My submission to this group, that is not going to happen for the following reasons. The Russians are fighting for a certain set of objectives. That is with regard to Ukraine. It is no longer a war about Ukraine. It is a war on how to fix Russia once and for all in the international system. That is how the West is defining it. There are very strong calls in Washington to step on to a war economy. The United States has come back after 30 years of neglect of Europe in a strategic sense. It's come back and it's enforcing alliance diplomacy. The Germans have been asked to stand in line and they've stood in line, which is they've cut out the Nord Stream and they are ordering F-35 aircraft for the German Air Force. So what happens in Europe will be decided on energy and on defense by the United States. The United States is, to put it in layman's terms, it's worked up and it's angry. And the United States is brought to anger in whatever form they work in a very, very concerted way. There is bipartisan support, and Ambassador Puri said Russia is the problem. We keep deluding ourselves that somehow it's going to be China. Number one, this war is going to be very, very messy. Today, the West holds about $700 to $800 billion worth of Russian money that has been blocked, confiscated, expropriated, hidden, or taken away. Now, that problem is not going to go away. If there's a stalemate in Ukraine, there'll be the issue of Russian reparations for the rebuilding of Ukraine. Ukraine will never be admitted to the EU without Russia paying for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Right? It's not going to happen. The energy the energy supplies to Europe are still continuing. That is still an escalation ladder. The Americans have not said EU can have energy until forever. They have said we're going to have put a deadline and we're going to find out how it's going to be done. How can it be done? It can be done by restarting coal, restarting nuclear, filling up the strategic reserves, by getting more energy from the Middle East, from diverting energy from Asia. And the cost of all this is going to be much higher. European energy will rise 3-4 times. But that is what the Americans are saying. For new security, you will have to pay more. Now, that is the slogan. Now, the sense that we have in this group is that globalization provided a free market, and it's very right, according to the principles of the free market, we need to go out and reach out to where capital is, where technology is. Perfect. And if you go by that logic, choosing the right side should determine how we play out this issue. My submission to you is that that world is over. It's gone. We will need to deal with the fact that there will be no single SWIFT or American clearance system for banking in the world. It's not going to be there. RBI until now, our RBI, being the good conservative organization that it is, never considered the fact that we need to have national currency transfers. National currency transfers will become inevitable in addition to the regular transfers. So that is the true fragmenting multipolarity of the world in the financial sector. Now, in the past, the Americans never openly said that your access to the financial and technological structure was based on your geopolitical alignment. It was always in the background. Now they will say it openly. They have said it openly. They've asked American companies, Western companies to pull out of Russia for no reason. I mean, there are no sanctions on those sectors. I mean, there are no sanctions on McDonald's earning money in Russia. Why have they done that? Because this is no longer a normal conflict. This is a societal conflict. And we are still at the beginning of how this is going to build up. I would wait until tomorrow morning on the sort of reception that President Zelensky's speech will be given in the US Congress. It will be unprecedented because it is the timing and it is the message. And the United States of America has stirred itself and is providing leadership to the West. Whether it's right or wrong is a different matter. All I'm submitting, sir, is that the batting wicket has changed. Now, let's not play for a bowling wicket when it's going to be, hard pacers coming our way. And I have not answered the question on India, but I think this fundamental recalibration in our own thinking, that this is a bad dream, we wake up in the morning, it's all going to go away, that's not going to happen.
Thank you, sir. I do now finally want to ask the two generals their take on my question. Ambassador Varma has basically argued that this is a fight to the finish between the West and Russia, the outcome of which, we haven't talked about a good outcome for Russia, but the outcome of which the Western powers would want is a diminished and crushed Russia. I mean, Russia is capable of anger just as much as the United States has. And, one could argue that President Putin has taken these measures because 20 million Russians basically sacrificed their lives in the Second World War, and he's not going to stand idly by while Russian security is threatened. But let me ask you, gentlemen, as military men, we may be powerless, but what outcome is it of this titanic fight that India should want, other than just, homilies at the United Nations? Do we certainly have a dog in this fight, but do we have a weapon in this fight, or do we just have to be passive bystanders and just make sure that we don't get hit by the collateral damage? General Rajeshwar, would you like to start, or do you have any thoughts?
Yes, Dr. Bery.
And I apologize to the organizers. I'll just go a few minutes over time because we are at time now, if that's okay. Yeah, back to you, General.
Yes, Dr. Bery. I fully agree with Ambassador Varma that you are seeing a long drawn battle. As it has panned out, the US and the NATO or the European countries do want Russia absolutely down. I had stuck my neck out and said that the prognosis is insurgency, especially with so many weapons coming in into Ukraine. So that complicates the situation very much on the eastern flank of Europe. And that will be, I think, for here to stay. That is one. How do we look at it from the Indian perspective? One is we are aware of the supply chain management, since a lot of our equipment, defense equipment, particularly, is from Russia. It has always been key, whether you look at nuclear submarine technology, S-400s, which are still in the pipeline. CATSA sanction is, of course, how we deal with it. Then, AK-203. Then you're looking at, even Sukhois. Front-end technologies, I'm afraid, my sense is nobody in the world is going to give us. We have to make do with what we get. On the other hand, in any conflict, and if you look at our northern borders, if a conflict comes out and it becomes protracted, energy security will also make a huge dent in our operations if it goes from small to big. And how do we prepare? Saying one thing, that we will become, self-reliant in defense technologies is easy. Doing it is a long process. If you look at anything, even the S-400, if you look at it, it has taken 4 years or maybe 5 for it, when it has already been developed for 3 decades or 2 decades at least. So technologies, especially defense, need R&D, they need innovation, they need evolution, and they need production. All these lines need to be laid out. So I go back to my point. Internally, I think we have to prepare ourselves much better. The national security strategy has to be laid out. Everybody has to, have some kind of a framework or architecture. Otherwise, what will happen is we will only be able to deal with situations, and we'll respond as is appropriate only for the moment and not for the long term. So my sense is, I think that the earlier we do it, because this is going to get very complicated. There's a lot of international leverage which comes from acquisitions and supply chain for even for avionics. If we don't get semiconductors, how do you do avionics within your country? So many other things are there. So we have to work each and every one, the nitty-gritty out. And the defense budgets being what they are, my sense is Make in India is going to cost us much, much more, and we have to go for it. And therefore, it must start earlier than late. Thank you.
May I add to what General Rajeshwar said, sir? to add to what Rajeshwar has said is, if it's a fight to the finish between the Western powers and Russia, we are in trouble. Because to reorient ourselves from relying on Russia for 50% of our defense needs to do it make in India and change over to the West will take hell of a lot of time. It's not 2 years, 3 years, it is nothing less than 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So it's not a good situation for the armed forces. And we are happy if this conflict ends early and ends, I dare say, a little favorably to Russia. Otherwise, we are in trouble. Thank you.
Well, you, in a sense, very succinctly answered my question. Look, this has been an extremely rich and informative discussion for me, and I hope I'm speaking for the audience. I did try and bring in some of the points from the audience, but I just wanted to utilize the expertise in the panel. So let me, on my side, thank all of you for the obvious preparation you put in, the clarity of the points, and I think I leave certainly both better informed and rather alarmed about the challenges that face us. And what can one say? One is fortunate at the moment to have perhaps the most politically validated leader amongst the G20, and somebody who now has 7 years of experience in dealing at the top table. These are enormous challenges, but as Raja Mohan in his book pointed out, we faced similar challenges in '91, and they ended up both on the economic side and on the security side, and things came out okay. But I think this discussion has certainly indicated to me that the stakes now are very high, and that we may need a degree of national mobilization of a kind that I hadn't, frankly, anticipated before this discussion. So let me hand over to EGROW and thank them for their courtesy in entrusting me with the task of chairing this discussion, and thank all of the panelists for sharing their views and experience with us. Over to you, Colonel.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Suman Bery, for chairing the session, which has gone in a very balanced manner, and hearing the views from 3 angles: military, diplomatic, and economic angles. All the participants, I could see the number of questions and discussions in the chat window, some of which we incorporated in your remarks. Showed that a lot of interest was being taken. Now, the recording of today's event will be available on our website by noon tomorrow. That's for information of everyone. And coming up events of EGROW, on 18th March, we have a talk by Professor Lekha Chakraborty, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. And on 23rd March, we have a book discussion on Ganga by authors Rajiv Ranjan Mishra and Pushkar Upadhyay, published by Republic. So these are the upcoming events from EGROW, and I would like to end this webinar with thanking all the panelists as well as all the participants who have joined us here, accepted our invitation. I'd like to thank the chair, Dr. Suman Bery, for chairing this session. Thank you very much.
Right. Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
So